So how the physical environment, so we've gone from online now to physical, impacts learning in autistic students.
Okay, so like Sarah said, we're kind of trying to give you some ideas about your own learning and your own teaching, and teaching teachers how to teach from our work. So we've done a body of work on that's funded by an Education Horizons grant about how the physical environment, so the sensory, the physical space impacts learning for autistic students. So this was a 2022 Education Horizons grant. What happened was they put the call out and they asked about how the physical environment impacts students' wellbeing, learning, and we just put in like a grant to say, well, we can't do that for every student. We're happy to do it for autistic students, and it was funded. So just when they come out again, just think about, you don't have to answer the big question. They are interested in answers to sub-questions within that. So the reason we did this is because many autistic students and neurodivergent students, they process the information in the world differently. So we get what we call sensory processing differences. So you can have people who receive the world and receive information from the world and process it and have a hyper response. So their response is heightened, hyper is high. So it might be that noise of the fan of that computer is intolerable. Not just I don't like it, it's actually I can't manage with that noise on. You also have some people have a hypo-responsive profile, so they need more input before they experience the sense. So often we see that with a lot of children with maybe rough and tumble play, looking for that kind of physical touch input. And we also have children who have unusual sensory interests. And if you're interested in this, Kate's research area, all about sensory, so I would defer questions to her. What becomes really interesting is that you can have sensory responses that vary even in one domain. So you might be hypersensitive to a certain noise, like the hum of that, which is really bothering me. But you might be hypo-responsive to voice, and you might not always hear your name being called or respond in the same way. So you can have hyper and hypo-responsivity across your senses, but also within a sense. And it can differ based on the environment. So within your home, you might be able to manage certain noises and experiences. And within the school, because of your everything else that's going on, you might be hyper responsive to it. The sensory processing is really, really complex and really, really important for understanding how to help autistic students succeed in learning environments. We have a look at what we do know from our research. We know, as I said, autistic people have a range of sensory differences. We know that in neurotypical and neurodivergent students, sensory responses are associated with poor academic performance. We also know that sensory challenges or sensory processing differences are associated with anxiety. Of course they are. If you find that lights too bright, noise is too loud, the world is going to be a scary place. We also know that autistic students are not doing as well as school and getting the grades that are reflecting their ability or at university. But what the missing piece of the puzzle is, that's all focused on the student's sensory processing and their outcomes. But what about the physical environment? What elements of a physical environment might support learning for autistic people, might make learning harder, or might impact their well-being and therefore impact on their educational outcomes that way? Because you can change the environment. You cannot change a person. You cannot change a person's sensory profile. And why would you want to? That person is amazing as they are. You can change the environment. You might think you can't, but you often can. And this is a thing that comes up in a lot of our work. So we did another systematic review and looked at all the research literature that looked at how an aspect of a physical or school environment, lights, noise, space around you, impacts the student learning or student well-being for autistic students. We looked at 4 databases and had a series of keywords which went through the educational setting, sensory, physical, learning and well-being, autism. There were 3,688 articles which we went through and screened, and then found 21 research articles which comment on this. I'm just going to go through briefly some of the findings, but what I really want you to do is think as we go through them how you encourage your teachers that you're teaching, but also how you model in your teaching, how we think about these aspects and how we can accommodate them to support all students learning. So by far, the area that had the most research was auditory and noise. So there were 15 studies which looked at the impact of noise on autistic students' learning. 8 studies said that higher or specific noises decreased well-being, and 8 studies that said higher or specific noises like the school bell or the air conditioner reduces students' attention. And it's not always just noises in the sort of that you might be thinking of, but even the teacher shouting makes kids anxious, and therefore they can't concentrate and learn as well in class. Visual elements, where 11 studies which had looked at this, and this was a lot more varied. Artwork, green space and calm colours helped with well-being. Fluorescent lighting, if we could, many of us can attest to that, and I was really pleased they were off today, decreases well-being. Interestingly, visual distraction like artwork can really decrease attention skills. If it's not clear why it's up there and what you should take from it, it's very distracting for autistic students. So thinking about that, because we do encourage people to put things on a wall. Why is it there and how is it going to help students learn? There were 4 studies which reported on autistic students and the space they have on the working desk or space in schools. And all of those 4 showed that crowds reduce space on your working desk and reduce space as you walk around school. Reduce well-being and reduce learning, and ample workspaces increase learning. And there was quite a few quotations from students talking about class changes and actually how they lose a lot of time worrying about class change and then settling into new class because of the touch in the corridors. That is something we can change. Of course, you know, students can leave a bit earlier, a bit later, etc. If we realise kids are losing a proportion of every class worrying about what's going to happen in the corridor. And interestingly, there was small is meant to be smell. One study looking at temperature, one on small, but none of them thought about well-being. They both thought about student learning. So stuffy classrooms reduce learning, air-conditioned classrooms increase learning, and strong smells can be distracting. So overall, the most research looks at the noises and the visual, but actually we've got this kind of emerging evidence to say actually it's not just about what you can see and what you can hear. There's more areas we need to consider to support autistic students in schools and universities. Because it was an Education Horizons grant, we had to develop a load of infographics for teachers and got them out through the Department of Education, where we had to encourage teachers to think about the environmental setting, but also it helped us to think about when we're teaching, providing workshops, delivering, how we can set up the classroom so that the person can feel included, welcome, and be successful. The listening, how can we find ways of reducing noises? We ran a parent workshop and we always asked parents, how, you know, is there anything we need to be aware of to make you feel welcome and comfortable? And one parent wrote back saying, please don't provide clicky pens. I will not be able to concentrate if there's clicky pens. Easy accommodation to make. So we provided borrowers of pen lids, and then someone must have bought their own clicky pen. All I could feel was this person clicking a pen because I was aware of it. But that was enough to make that really hard for that person. So we tried to provide accommodation, but how do we help encourage ways of distracting noise? Visual, you know, thinking about those artworks and displays, what are you trying to help people to learn from it? These artworks are up here because of what? Do you explain them to students? Do you say to students, you don't need to look at this in your lesson. This is here to celebrate last week's work. This is what we're focusing on now. Consider the kind of lighting. If fluorescent tube lighting is flickering, just remove the fluorescent tube. And if someone says the lighting is painful, it probably is. People don't make this stuff up. You know, it really is a real experience. It's subjective. It's like when people say to me, you can't be cold, you're British. It's like, I can still be cold. So it feels really invalidating if you tell me I'm not experiencing something. It is really uncomfortable. Touch in space. What boundaries do we have? Do we let people sit on their own? the parent workshops we ran in Rockhampton, there was a school hosting it for us, and they were like, oh, what we'll do is we'll move it, nobody sits up front, we'll remove the front tables and then the front row up front. And I was like, no, if people don't want to sit up front, that's fine. Like, we can't force it. If people want to sit on their own, that's fine too. We give a very clear statement of inclusion at the beginning, saying whatever you want to do, you're welcome. You're welcome here. Whatever you need to do to belong, please do it. Sit on your own, stand up, walk around. And it does make a difference if you're one of the people who are used to receiving negative feedback on what you need to do to learn and to benefit from being there. And the temperature, I think it's just about asking. There is no perfect temperature. We have air conditioning wars in our office. One of us doesn't have any windows, and one of us thinks we should have right over the air conditioner. But some of us like it a little bit warmer than others. Other people think that's stuff. It's having those conversations. How do we make this? Are you comfortable? How do we make this place the best place for you to learn? And how are you going to tell me if you don't find it comfortable? I don't know if you share things like environmental audits with the teachers, but there's the Autism Education Trust has got a great one. I mean, there's probably lots out there, but they are things that every teacher could look at in the classroom and think about, is this working? You know, classroom illumination, are the flickering lights, are the light coming in through the blinds you're able to shut it off, etc. It's a really, really clear step-by-step checklist for checking your classroom and considering how inclusive it is for neurodivergent students. So in summary, all aspects of a physical environment can impact learning and wellbeing. How are we setting up our classrooms when we teach, and how are we encouraging our teachers to think about it in every class, across the year, across the day? The auditory and visual elements are the most researched, but that doesn't mean things like smell, touch, or small can impact on people. If we've got 74%, 3/4 of children on the spectrum reporting sensory differences, that means we really need to be thinking about what we're doing. There's no one-size-fits-all recommendation. It's about learning. As we've spoken today, it's about learning who's in front of you, who's in your room, getting to know them, and appreciating that can change over time across the year. And people brought this up today. It's been lovely. Model asking, model saying, how can I make this place more comfortable? Are people happy with the tables like this? Or do you prefer them another way? You can move them, providing permission to change the environment so that someone can be the best versions of themselves. And then keep in mind that while we can modify the environment to support learning and wellbeing, modifications should be individualised. There is no one size fits all. If a student says to you they need X, Y, or Z, how do we make that happen? And if not, how do we help them to express when they need to leave the room because it's got too much if it's not changeable? And then I think I'm pretty much bang on time.
1 minute.
1 minute, extra question.
Dance break.
Any questions?
So online, Judy has wondered if open style or double teaching spaces may be problematic.
As in the huge, like mega classrooms.
Yeah.
I mean, double space, double noise, double potential. Depends how they're set up. I guess there's no one answer to that. If there's twice as much noise, twice as much unpredictability, twice as much movement. But if you've got a room that's twice as big, so you can have all different areas that are set up for everybody's preferences, then you've got twice the opportunity to meet the needs.
And it depends on what you're doing. What task? It depends also on what task you're doing. So if you're doing something where you've got to concentrate, then very noisy can be more problematic than if you're doing another task. So it's not like you have to set the classroom up in a set way and it has to stay there, and the poor neurodivergent student has to sit in the corner by themselves because they like quietness when they've got to concentrate. But that means they've got to stay there for the whole of the term of their natural life. It's different tasks, different places. So your ability to manage or your awareness of sensory stuff will depend on the task or the things that you're doing at that time.
Great, thank you for that
question.
So you've used terminology like autistic, neurodiversity, neurotypical, and I think disability as well. Am I wrong? How are those terms different, and are we all neurodivergent?
No.
Oh,
Oh my God, no.
Sorry.
To my children's thing.
Yeah.
A brief so,
Slightly triggering.
Maybe I'm neurodiverse, Harry, and I didn't get that. So you should be sympathetic to me. My individual learning needs.
So neurodiversity is, appreciating the brain think and process the world differently. Neurodivergent is when you have a brain that processes and responds to input the world in a way that isn't the majoritative way. The majoritative way is neurotypical. The minority way, by definition, is neurodivergent. Within that, we would have different neurotypes: autistic, ADHD, dyspraxia, etc. And of course, you can have multiple co-occurring conditions. We are not all a little bit anything. Like, if you actually look at the words autism spectrum disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, there's a D there. This is having a significant impact on someone's life. If you want some really bad life outcome statistics, just look at any of them for neurodivergent conditions. So it's, people have a life where they are continually in the minority, and you can't see it and you can't feel it. So it is actually really important that we respect those diagnostic categories, and we respect that actually that brings a life of challenge living in the neurotypical world. And so therefore, like we wouldn't say we're all a little bit other, other minority groups. You respect that.
Okay, so I probably didn't phrase it properly. Let me rephrase it. The labels of how many people are now put into an autism on the autism spectrum or are identified as neurodiverse. And the schools that I've worked in seem to have increased. So out of a population of 500, as we discussed this morning, there might be 200 that are in that category. Is that because these instruments that we're using to identify that has now created a label, or is there a social condition that's exacerbating some of these conditions?
One or both.
Or we feel actually
Both.
welcome to identify with these conditions now. I can name you a lot of people that I know didn't identify as neurodivergent until they've got into adulthood and gone, okay, I know who I am now, and I'm actually comfortable enough with myself to say, well, that does not happen the same for me. And I think we're all on a journey of learning about ourselves. And just because you didn't have the opportunity to learn about yourself and why you might find X, Y, Z more challenging than others, and you just had to mask it and just hold on tight, that doesn't mean it's
No, I get that.
it doesn't mean it's a challenge. I think, you look back at school and I can identify many people who would have been diagnosed. So there's a big group of people who are identifying in this way, and actually it's really important. And if you process and think about the world differently, and you can then understand why X is hard for you or Y is hard for you, that helps us to know. And actually for it to be part of the young people's culture, I think it's fantastic. Like, I know many young people who appreciate getting a diagnosis or identifying as it because it makes sense. It's kind of Jack Denhouting's an autistic advocate. She says, and they say, I suddenly realised I wasn't a failed neurotypical person. I was a perfectly good autistic person, and it changed their whole life around, rather than feeling like a failure. So I think that's why we're hearing more about it now, is because suddenly you breathe a sigh of relief and go, okay, that makes sense.
Sure. And then on the other side, you hear people being identified as ADHD, and in fact, they're not that. They've actually, somebody's diagnosed them as that, and then they've gone to someone else and said, well, I don't even know why you got that diagnosis. So there are actually, the point I'm trying to say is that some of these diagnostic tools are being used in particular ways that aren't necessarily working for the people being labelled in that basis.
Yeah, I mean, that can be said for any diagnosis.
Yeah. And the fact that they went to someone meant that things were tough.
Exactly.
Somewhere.
People
So
don't
they,
normally go to
yeah.
someone unless there's something.
certainly,
Yeah. So how is that different from disability? Are we still using the term disability, and is that for physical disabilities?
Yeah, so some people would say their autism is a disability, and some people just say it's a condition. And it's just a neurotype, and actually it's the world that causes the disability. The disability is not within them. And even some people would just say, I do not see my autism as a disability, or my ADHD is a disability. So that is very much personal, which is, I have a problem with disability services for that reason.
The one that's related to the diagnostic criteria that it has to have a negative impact on 3 areas of life.
Exactly, that's why you get the disorder.
The disorder.
Doesn't mean, so autistic is person first, lots of autistic people say, I am autistic, every part of me. This is not, just my left hand, this is my left hand, so most of my dyspraxia. Never left.
Yeah.
So it's, again, go back to that terminology of what people prefer.
I know we have one more question.
Yeah,
Can we
Steph,
set
if you want to say your.
It's all set up,
It's all
so
set up,
whenever
yes.
your questions are.
Have you done any research, what you've been doing in the area of the use of brain breaks?
So, well, we haven't done any research, but, allowing people time to process, allowing people time away from demands, allowing things like that.
Just getting up and moving.
Exactly, but it's not doesn't stop you. Like there used to be sensory diets, right? You need 3 minutes first swing and this, and if you have it all in the morning, you won't need it in the day. That's not how brains work, So actually having something that you can communicate, I need a break, or having a built-in break throughout the day. I don't think there's any particular research on it, but as in it's effective. It depends what your outcome is, doesn't it? Like, what are you measuring and how would you expect to see that improve? But allowing someone appreciating the world when you process the world differently and you're continually, your brain is on plus to process the world differently. Having a break wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing every now and again. And we all build it in, like we all go and have a cup of tea. Maybe some more than others.
Okay, thank you. My speaker for today, Stephanie Malone. She's talking about perspectives on teaching and supporting mathematics development, one of your big research areas. So over to you.
So, hi everybody. This project I'm going to talk about today, it's just finished analysing it, so it's all nice and fresh. It's actually possible due to an AL school grant. So that was awarded to us in here in Griffith. Okay, so what we know is despite the media portraying that autistic people all excel in mathematics, that's not necessarily true. When we look at the research, it's about a quarter of autistic children or autistic individuals actually have challenges within mathematics that isn't explainable by a cognitive ability. So they're showing math skills lower than you would expect based on their cognitive skills. And actually only something like 5% have the excelling in mathematics that you would typically expect thanks to the media. So very little research has actually looked at this and looked at why this is the case. And the research that has been done has very much lent heavily on what we know from neurotypical individuals to try and help understand why autistic people may have challenges in this area. So some of the research has looked at, well, what are the predictors of maths ability for autistic children? Some of them have looked at, well, here's a pre-existing intervention. Is this effective for autistic kids as well? But no one's really sat back and gone, maybe they learn in a different way. Maybe we need to understand how they learn best to be able to then put these interventions in place to best support them. So, who's better to ask? Obviously the children, but in lieu of the children, their teachers. Their teachers are so experienced in helping their children learn. So we turn to the teachers and go, okay, so from your experience of working with these children, what are the strengths that you see in them? What parts of maths do they excel in? What parts do they find a little bit more challenging? Is there any differences between how autistic kids learn and their neurotypical counterparts? And what strategies and curriculum changes have you found that are effective in supporting the maths development of these kids? So that's exactly what we did. We spoke with 11 teachers. I know it's only a small number, but it took me a year to get 11 teachers. So it was the best I could achieve. Once I got over that 10, I was like, excellent. So 11 teachers. And all of these teachers have worked with primary school aged autistic children within the last year. So they're all experienced and that memory is fresh in their minds. So of those, we had a nice spread. We had 5 of them who had worked in special schools and 6 of them who were currently working in mainstream. But importantly, those in special schools had also worked in mainstream, so they could talk about those differences between autistic and non-autistic kids too. So we did some semi-structured interviews. I said it'd be around about an hour, and we had a mean duration of 52 minutes. And then I used inductive thematic analysis for my very, very first time to try and figure out what these teachers were saying and what exactly we found. And thanks to Kate for her assistance. So I found that there were 4 emergent themes. So we had removing ambiguity, comprehending and using the language, planning that supports the learner, and recognizing prior notions and experiences. So due to time and the fact that qualitative takes so long to explain, I'm just going to talk about the first 2. So removing ambiguity and comprehending and using the language. So removing ambiguity, this was the most prominent theme that emerged. The teachers spoke about this a lot. All of the teachers mentioned this. So it's the idea that mathematics is often a very abstract thing. I know, thinking back to my own school experiences, I had to learn about integration and differentiation. What is that and what does it do? It's so abstract. And what they found is that abstract nature of mathematics can be challenging for autistic students. So we see here that one teacher said, if it's a little bit abstract, unless I've really sat down and explained that task to them, they can become frustrated quite easily and give up. So it seems it's that abstract nature, that lack of concrete understanding, that is actually one of the things that's quite challenging. So autistic learners were reported to find those abstract tasks challenging. So if it's an open-ended, unstructured task, it's associated with a sense of overwhelm if the task hasn't been explained clearly enough or enough guidance been provided on how to accomplish that task. Then finally, when we think about how we can help support students who have this difficulty with ambiguity, teachers often said that they use visual supports and explicit instruction to help remove that ambiguity, to help increase that concreteness of what it is that they're doing. So teachers use visuals, so that's those visual supports, which I thought was a lovely example. So if you're just sitting there and someone says, oh, add a half to a third, what does that mean? Like, how can you visualize what a half is, what a third is? It's really quite ambiguous. But once someone actually gives you a paper plate and divides it into those portions and shows you how half fits into the thirds and quarters and all makes more sense. You've got that concrete thing in front of you. You can visualize it now. And having that concrete visualization is actually really supportive for autistic children, as reported by these teachers. So we then had comprehending and using the language. So this was our next most prominent theme. So the linguistic components of mathematics were identified as a challenge. So whether that's providing a verbal response to the question that's been asked, or whether it's just trying to understand what the task is asking in the first place. So one teacher said that the communication skills around articulating processes, answering, you've got to have that inferential comprehension. And I found that the language skills is actually probably the greatest things for kids showing their mathematical language. So he's underpinning that it's not necessarily the maths that's challenging. It's understanding what they're trying to get at. What do the teachers want you to do? Can you understand the language? Can you understand the task? And then also with maths, there's so many ways that we can word things. We can have really wordy word problems, or we can make it really concise in one sentence. We can say add, we can take plus or sum. All of these things mean the same thing. But there's all this language that goes into it. So if you're having trouble understanding that language, then it's going to make demonstrating your maths ability a lot harder. So the challenges were most evident in those word problems, as you would probably expect. So one teacher said that the reason why we struggle to apply mathematical concepts to problem-solving questions doesn't come down to the child's mathematical ability, but more their actual ability to understand what the question is asking. It comes to the comprehension of the question. And then I've always found as well tasks and mathematics tasks that are too literacy heavy. The literacy demands are too much, the mathematics can get lost for children on the spectrum. So it's that language component, and again, it's the ability to read the question to actually discern what the important points are, as opposed to the ability to do the maths task itself. So to support the kids with this, teachers use lots of different strategies to help kind of demystify understanding that language. So some teachers find it useful to read the information aloud to the child so that literacy skills had been removed, so it wasn't a reading test anymore, it's back to being more of a maths test. And then some of them use different coloured highlighters. So they highlighted key words for the children to focus on. So it wasn't a mass of words now, it was just these are the things you need to think about, and this is how you're going to solve the maths problem. So, in terms of removing ambiguity, that was the most prominent theme. Everybody said it so many times. And so it actually embeds really well with the literature. There is a growing body of literature that suggests that autistic people can have relative challenge when acquiring abstract knowledge compared to concrete knowledge. So if it's something you can clearly see and visualize, that's that concrete stuff that tends to be easier to acquire. And then there's also, when we think of evidence-supported practices, so interventions and strategies that can be put into place to help support learning, we know that using that visual support, so the paper plates to help with maths and that kind of stuff, and also the direct instructions, they're evidence-supported practices for academic skills more broadly. There is now an increasing amount of research looking at whether these things are useful for mathematics, more so the visual supports compared to the direct instruction, but it is showing that there is this evidence there that it can help support a wide variety of math skills, such as addition, subtraction, fractions, beautiful plates. And so the implication, when we're teaching, we need to just be aware that with mathematics, there is a lot of abstract terms. And unless you can see what that looks like, it's quite hard to grasp what a fraction is, what differentiation is, I still don't know, what integration is. Without actually being able to visualize it, it can make it quite hard to learn. So if we're able to use these visual strategies to help minimize that abstract nature, the teachers found that that was effective for the students. And also to make sure that the information we provide is clear and structured. So it gives those prompts that direct sort of instruction. Then we have comprehending and using the language. So autistic children may experience, from research, we know autistic children may experience challenges in comprehension, and this can happen in lots of different areas, but it could be particularly relevant when we're trying to consider the context. So often when we're comprehending what's being told to us, we infer the meaning of things based on the whole context, and some autistic people can find that more challenging, or when the language is figurative rather than literal. And then autistic children can also experience challenges with reading comprehension. So we know this already, reading comprehension can be a relative challenge compared to reading fluency. So just because someone's able to read something doesn't mean they're necessarily understanding it. And we know this from the literature working with autistic kids. So implications, again, use clear language. Make sure that you're not overwhelming the words there, just have the things that are necessary to actually do the task. Be mindful that if you're looking at assessing mathematics, you are assessing mathematics and not literacy. Obviously, word problems are a part of the curriculum, so there will be occasions when that is being used, but just be aware it's also literacy as well as the mathematics component. And then also to consider ways to support children to identify the most relevant aspects of the word problem. So highlighting the thing, but then it kind of takes away the overwhelm. You've got the key things that you need to focus on. So in conclusion, maths includes lots of different abstract concepts and processes, and considering how those ambiguous concepts can be made more concrete could be beneficial for autistic learners. And then the linguistic components of mathematics may actually mask the learner's actual ability. So just because they can't answer a word problem doesn't mean they don't know the answer. It could just be that language component that's making it more challenging. Thank you.
Did any of the educators that you interviewed articulate concerns around the new version 9 of the curriculum, given the maths curriculum is, I should identify as a maths teacher myself, the version 9 of the curriculum is so heavily built in the maths curriculum around problem solving. Have any of them articulate the concerns about moving and transitioning from 8.4 to 9?
So there was one teacher that did mention about concerns of moving in the curriculum, but he never went into detail about why that was, no matter how much I kind of prompted.
Yeah.
But there was concerns from one teacher. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of the teachers never really spoke about the curriculum at all. It was all about how they delivered the content, how they supported the students rather than the curriculum.
Where to from here? So how are you going to progress this research?
Well, I am currently speaking with autistic adults about their perspectives. Ethics is easier to work with adults. So I'm asking them to think back to when they were at school and so we're seeing if it corroborates what the teachers said. Anecdotally, I was speaking with someone the other day and they said that when they were at school, they couldn't articulate their answer, how they got to that answer, because it wasn't a maths process. They were actually seeing it in like hills and trees, and it was how all that came together, similar like a synesthesia kind of thing. Obviously, the teachers aren't able to see that sort of process. Not saying that happens for everybody, but it's only through speaking with autistic people themselves you can hear that. So I'm speaking with autistic people to find out what their experiences were at school, but also the implications that it has now on their adult life. So has it influenced their career? What do they find challenging when it comes to mathematics in work or in their daily life? So that's currently where it's going, but there's a lot more to do.
I think the visual, there's a lot of little short videos that explain these concepts. If you Google, those things. Have any of them used those? Teachers use those, like.
I don't know specifically about the teachers. In terms of the research that's looked at intervention and supports for autistic primary school children, no one's used that to date. Not that I'm aware.
Okay. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're like,
Amy.
I don't know if I'm generalizing, because looking at math as inquiry processes, I really like how you tackle it as problem solving as a skill set. Just wondering with the general pattern with autistic students, from problem solving skill set, like which phases do they have most difficulties with? Is it the identification of problem, or is it actually other phases in solving inquiry phases? Because I teach in science, I would like to know which phase I need to support my students the most and what ways.
No one's looked at this. We can totally do this study. Yeah, no one's really looked at it. We don't know at what point becomes that challenge. I mean, thinking about the word problems, the challenge potentially is also that reading comprehension to begin with. So it happens right at the very start, understanding the process. But yeah, we don't know.
so what type of support based on this research would you then provide to teachers to help students in their classes? Like, so things to be just additional time in exams, or just, what sort of type of
So
real.
it's more from these, like this is 11 teachers, and we don't know that much about this area. But it's really about having not necessarily extra time in the exam or anything. It's more about how the information is provided for them to really get an idea of what these concepts mean, so they can see how it works in the real world. Why is it important I'm learning this concept? How does it apply to life? What does it look like? And once that concrete understanding is there, that seems to be helpful from speaking with these teachers. The more research, to see if it actually is effective when it comes to support strategy.
We have a lot of autistic kids, and I teach in high schools though, and they found they couldn't decode the word problem. That was, so I would write alternative assessment at the same level, but an alternative version where I took out the words, and it was just the maths problem. So I was just assessing the maths skill as opposed to their decoding skill. Yeah. And then when they got into senior, they liked maths more because it came about numbers rather than words.
Yeah.
Whereas in junior secondary, maths is about words, and in senior secondary, it's about numbers. And when they could just deal with numbers, they liked it a lot more.
So there's a lot of research looking at maths anxiety for non-autistic people. There's a little bit starting to look at maths anxiety for autistic people. But what you see is that maths anxiety starts to really form once you get towards the end of primary school, beginning of secondary, when it does start to get more complex. And if there are what the research has shown so far is if we can help reduce that anxiety at the start, so removing the thing that causes the anxiety, then that anxiety doesn't necessarily happen or doesn't come to the same degree. And so people are more willing to carry on and learn more about mathematics because that stressful experience isn't there.
Thank you. What a great way to end I thought a really interesting day. So thank to all our ACE researchers. It was just the perfect end to, I think, our discussion today. I'm going to gather up the bits of paper that may be left on your table, so please don't throw them away as you walk out the door. And I just want to I realised today, but I'm going to use this as a bit of an illustration. I did not start the day with an acknowledgement of country because I was so running behind and so harassed when I got here. But I think in that space that we were talking about before, where we can all talk together and, you know, make mistakes and try and disagree and all sorts of stuff, that's the kind of environment where, you know, it would have been okay if someone came up and said, Fran, you